April meeting of the Women's Spirituality Group at St. Martin's. And let me get this out of my face. And just a note that the meeting is being recorded for those who sadly could not be with us today. Thanks to Amy Stewart for handling all our Zoom issues and also for managing to record the meeting. And we're so excited about this meeting to have Mary Fasano with us. And we all need to thank Sheila Hugeboom, longtime friend of Mary's, who at one of the Lenten suppers suggested, when I asked her about a program on Afghan refugees, I said that I would love to have someone speak about Ukraine. And Sheila was like, I know someone who was a Peace Corps volunteer there. And so this is how the program, it's the genesis of our program this afternoon. And I'd like to say a couple words about how we'll proceed. Sheila will introduce our speaker, and then we'll go right into the presentation. And if you have a question, Amy's going to mute all of us as the presentation begins. But does everybody know how to unmute themselves? Okay, if you have a question, unmute yourself, and you can ask it at any point. Mary says you can ask it at any point when she finishes talking, catches a breath or something. Okay, so we're going to be informal, and I, like you, I'm so looking forward to today. And thank you to everyone who made this possible. And Sheila, you're on.
Thank you. Well, I knew Mary when we both worked for in Rhode Island, I don't know, Mary, a very long time ago. And I was thrilled to work with her when she was working with nonprofits as a banker. And our paths would cross many times at networking events. And you could just tell she was always out there looking for ways to help people and engage in social service as a banker. And it was a wonderful experience. I immediately gravitated towards her. Mary was born in a large Irish Catholic family in Providence. She has brothers and sisters. A large family, was a first generation to go to college, and her parents instilled in her this particular interest in service and in education. She went to Vermont to college, to St. Michael's College, and that kicked her off on her life of service to the community. As I said, she was a banker lending to nonprofits. And, that is kind of a different world for a banker. You have to have a big heart as well as a big wallet. And so she represented her institutions very well. She left New England and went to Georgia for 10 years and had a lot of personal growth there, and then came back to Rhode Island, which is when I met her. She earned a master's degree in community economic development, which again helped her to pull together all the things that she was interested with. And that led her to make a decision to join the Peace Corps in 2017. I would say when I heard this, we are not like intimate friends, but social networking friends from business. And I wasn't surprised. It is kind of the way her career seemed to have been going, but a wonderful sacrifice on her part. She came back to the United States when they closed the Peace Corps at the beginning of the pandemic in 2019, and has been working for the EPA in the Baltimore, Washington area, again, as kind of a lender on big infrastructure projects on wastewater and stormwater systems, something you might see, happening in your community. She doesn't know what she's going to do next, but we may hear about that as she goes on with her talk today and hear from her again. So Mary, I can't thank you enough. I'm thrilled to hear from you and welcome to our group today.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you so much for inviting me. It actually, it really touches me that people are interested to hear what I have to say about Ukraine and that people really care about this country. It's been just heartbreaking over the past month and a half to be watching what is happening there. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I know about that country and those people. I will say that, just kind of disclaimers, I am not a student of like the history of Ukraine, so it's not like this is what I've studied my whole life. So a lot of my knowledge is just from having lived there and absorbed a lot about the people. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about first, what a little bit about Peace Corps. I'm sure you all know what Peace Corps is, but to give you a little bit perspective of what that means kind of on the ground, then I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that I did in Ukraine, which I think gives insight into what it's like to work with people in a post-Soviet country. And then, of course, we'll talk about what's going on now in Ukraine and my experience with people there. I do encourage questions at any time. I'd rather answer what is of interest to you than for me to just kind of go on and on about a country that I love so much. First of all, this is the Vyshyvanka. So it's the national shirt of Ukraine. So it's kind of elaborately embroidered. And every region in Ukraine has their own Vyshyvanka design and colors. So people in Ukraine can tell where people are from based upon their Vyshyvanka, which is, I don't even know where this one is from. This was just one that I tried on at the bazaar that I liked. So this is the one I purchased for myself. But we do have a PowerPoint presentation that with pictures, because I think it helps to have a visual so that you can see what we're talking about. So obviously, Peace Corps Ukraine, that's the national flag of Ukraine, which, if you don't know, the blue is the sky and the gold is just fields of grain. And as you've probably read, Ukraine is the breadbasket to the world. And at this time, there's actually concern about grain not getting out of the ports. And there could be, some severe issues with famine in some countries as a result of that. So the war in Ukraine definitely has global impacts. Okay, so the next screen.
There you go.
So when you first go into the Peace Corps, you have 3 months of language training and technical training. So my group, when I went into the Peace Corps, we were in the city of Chernihiv, and this map shows Ukraine and it shows where Chernihiv is. Chernihiv has been a city that has been heavily bombed. It was one of the first cities that was really being heavily bombed and destroyed. You can see it's on the border of Russia. And we were in the city of Chernihiv, which was really close to the Russian border. There were 75 volunteers in my group. Ukraine was actually the largest Peace Corps country before the pandemic. I joined Peace Corps in Ukraine because I wanted to be in Europe. I wanted to work in a post-Soviet country that needed community development work. And not all Peace Corps countries have community development work. So that's what I did in Ukraine. So Ukraine had 3 Peace Corps sectors. One was community development, one was teaching English, and one was youth development. And you serve in the country based upon what the country wants. So they had requested community development volunteers who had a lot of experience. So as a result of that, there were also a lot of older volunteers like myself in Ukraine who had really strong backgrounds in having worked with nonprofits in the United States. But that's the region. So that's where I was. That's where all of us were as volunteers for the first 3 months that we were there.
Mm.
Okay, the next slide. Then you are assigned to a city. So then I was assigned to the city of Chernobyl. So that is, you can see, in the western part of Ukraine. And as you've read the news, you probably see where a lot of the military activity has taken place. So Chernobyl, I mean, fortunately for my friends who live there, has been relatively unscathed at this time as a result of the war. And of course, during, if you don't know, Ukraine was invaded by Russia in 2014, and they were occupying portions of the east. So there were parts of the country we were not even allowed to go as Peace Corps volunteers. And much of that was in the east. So I really spent a lot of my time in the western part of the country. And I also spent a lot of time just staying in my city because I said, this is why I'm here. Not to travel around and have fun. My job is to hang around with the people in the city and help them. So I stayed put a lot. Okay, next slide. This is a picture looking out from the window of the apartment building I lived in when I first moved to Chernobyl. And you've seen pictures in the news, but this is what cities look like. Large apartment buildings. The first place I lived in Chernihiv, I was on the 14th floor. The second place I lived in, I was on the 9th floor. And often the elevators didn't work. So lots of walking up and down stairs. I was fortunate, my permanent apartment that I found was on the first floor. Okay, next slide. So these were the family that I lived with in Chernihiv. So you all live with a host family. This was my host family in Chernihiv, Sasha and Lena. And so this is interesting. They only spoke Russian. They did not speak Ukrainian. They didn't speak English. And I was studying Ukrainian. So I would get up every day and go to language lessons, and I'd be there for 4 or 5 hours a day learning Ukrainian. And I'd come home and I'd be asking them questions about Ukrainian words, and they didn't know what I was asking them. They didn't. So you just learn how to, it's amazing how you learn how to communicate without language. They did have a 10-year-old daughter who spoke English, so she became my translator. Sasha, so this is interesting because people are like, well, you know, Ukraine, especially with the war, you have Russian speakers in the country and Ukrainian speakers. Sasha worked in Russia, so he would travel to Russia for work. They spoke only Russian. His daughter lived in Crimea, which was occupied by Russia, and she was forced to take on Russian citizenship. And these people were so patriotic towards Ukraine, it wasn't even funny. So their whole heart and soul was invested into the future of Ukraine as a country, even though they had such strong connections to Russia, and even though they were Russian speaking. Okay, the next picture. This was a picture of the host family I lived in with in Chernobyl, Lena and Oleg. And just the sweetest couple, and they spoke no English, and my Ukrainian was never very good, but we did get by. So I just wanted to show you who they were. Okay, next slide. So we had 3 months with the host family in Chernihiv during training, and then 6 months with my host family in Chernobyl, and then I was allowed to get my own apartment. So this is a picture of my apartment, which is very, very typical. This is the kitchen. You are seeing the entire kitchen. This is it. And you'll have families of 4 and 6, people living in an apartment with this size kitchen. The washing machines in the kitchen, as you can see, the stove, the oven didn't work, 2 burners didn't work on the stove, things would leak all the time. That little tiny table is the kitchen table. And you see the little stool there in front of the washing machine. That's what people had, little tiny stools all over their houses because they could tuck them under furniture to move them. Okay, next slide. And this is my living room. So this is the size of the living room. And then I had 2 bedrooms that were about this, that were also small, and a bathroom. And all the apartments come furnished. So this was all there. When I moved in, people just leave stuff in the cabinets. They leave dishes and stuff. People just, everything is rented, furnished. Okay, next slide. This just shows you a gathering I had in my apartment, because even though places are tiny, people love to get together. So these were all my Ukrainian friends and one other Peace Corps volunteer who was also in my city, who worked at the university teaching English. All right, next slide. Oh, I just wanted to show a picture of the bus. It's not a great picture, but it does give a good impression of, like, they were just like people standing everywhere when you were on the bus. So it was always really crowded. If you had an issue with personal space, Ukraine was not a good place to be. And, this is a country, like a lot of, countries that are not, developed like the United States, where people do not have cars. They really rely on public transportation to get around. What I found interesting about the bus is that people would just squeeze on, and then the bus, everything is in cash, and you would hand your money to people and they would pass it up to the bus driver. He would make change, he would hand the change back, and it would get passed back to you. So there was money being moving up and down the bus all the time with people's cash. It was really interesting. All right, next picture. This is just a picture of the outside of the train. So buses heavily used to get around locally, and to get to far away places, everyone used the train. And it's such an affordable means of travel that people said to me, "What are you going to miss when you leave Ukraine?" I said, "I'm really going to miss the trains." It was just such a civilized way of getting around. Next picture. And this is a picture of the inside of the train. So when I traveled to the capital, Kyiv, I would travel, by a sleeper car. So this was the 3rd class sleeper car, which I liked, because the first class sleeper car, there's only 2 in the compartment and the door closes, which made me really uncomfortable because I was usually traveling alone and I didn't know who I was going to be in that compartment with. So I like traveling 3rd class, where you have all these open beds all over the place. So that I figured there were more eyes on me, and it made me feel really safe, like really, really, really safe. So that just gives you an idea of like what the country looks like, what the buildings look like, what my apartment looked like, what the trains look like. Are there any questions now?
Mary, could you describe, could you describe what a typical woman's life was like, a typical woman's day?
That is a really good question. Okay, so, wow. Okay, women in Ukraine, number one, are very well educated in general. And I met older women who had been worked in the space program, who were retired now. No one in Ukraine has a lot of money. So a lot of older women who were living in retired women were living in poverty because they weren't getting enough pension and rising, inflation with the cost of gas. So there were a lot of poor older women, but like your typical woman, like raising kids, I think it's still very traditional in terms of women's roles in the family. But I have to say this, in my work, I was in a large city. I was not in a small village. And my work, I hung out with younger people who were not married and raising kids. So I don't have as much insight as other volunteers who lived in villages and who were teachers and interacted with parents a lot. Yeah, so I think it.
But what about the young people, Mary? What about the women who were working? You were engaged with working young professionals, working or students, and what was their day like?
Yeah, so people, so what's interesting with young people there is, they pretty much devote themselves to their education. And there is not a lot of involvement with part-time, and I'm talking young adults, right? Not a lot of involvement with like part-time sports or part-time jobs. Like they're really, really, really devoted to their education. These people are highly educated. And most of the young people I worked with were also really devoted to studying English. So they were constantly studying, like constantly. That's what they did. And their parents did not require them to do any chores around the house, to take a part-time job. They weren't involved with extracurricular sports. So it was very different from how young people in the United States, what I perceive as how young people in the United States operate.
Was the education state supported?
Yes, pretty much all of the education is state supported. All right, this is going to blow your mind. Some of the highest incidents of corruption occurred in the education sector, with people paying for grades. It was just insane. To me, that's just insane. Teachers were not well paid, so they would supplement their income by kind of extorting students, by also failing students. So then the students had to hire them for one-on-one tutoring in order to get better grades. And I knew volunteers who were teachers who at the end of the semester, they would put in their grades for what, each student had earned, but they knew that that was not the grade that might actually get on the student's record. Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. And there was a big movement in the country, obviously, to change that, because it's just, you're not doing anyone a favor. You're not doing the student a favor. You're not doing the country a favor, and if a student then like earns a degree in medicine, and that degree might have less validity outside of Ukraine, because other people know that there is corruption in the educational system.
Mary,
Yes.
Could you speak to sort of a percentage of people who had, that you could tell, had an active religious life?
The city I lived in was had the oblast that I live in. So oblast is like state, right? So the state I lived in, had more churches per capita than any other region in Ukraine. People, the host family that I lived with was extremely religious. The second one I lived with. The first one I lived with, they were not. But in general, people are very strong believers, and they're very attached to the Orthodox Church. And while I was there, my last year there, the Orthodox Church, which was being governed by the Patriarchy out of Moscow, changed from Moscow to Istanbul under the Patriarchy of the Orthodox Church in Istanbul. And it was a huge deal for the Orthodox. It was a big fight in the country and a big deal. And I, at the time, did not understand what big a deal it was. And now I understand, because now I'm reading about the Russian church, the Orthodox Russian Church. They are very close to Putin, and they are really, endorsing the war and the murder of Ukrainians, the Orthodox Church in Russia. But that was a huge deal. But people are very religious. Oh, one of my pictures, actually, let's go through this. We can go through kind of quickly. Let me show you. They have a lot of religious holidays with days off. All right, let's see. That's just my office. You can move on. You can move on. That's just young activists at the office. Move on. My young friends. We can move on. Let me just tell you this. This was my 59th birthday. These 3 people in my office, their ages added up to 58. So I had to take a picture. I'm like, 3 of you doesn't even equal 1 of me. Go ahead. All right, move on. All right, move on. Move on. Move on. Move on. Move on. I'm going to show you. Go ahead. All right, this was I'll come back to that. Move on. Move on. All right, so this is the Feast of the Epiphany. And this is a huge religious holiday in Ukraine. Everything is closed. And the priests bless the water. They cut out, you can't really see it here, but they cut out ice in the form of a cross, and people dunk into the water to cleanse themselves of their sins. So people are very religious in the country. If you go by a church, people bless themselves. They do it backwards. They do it the opposite way than I'm used to. I did not meet a lot of Jewish people in the country, but I had just one friend that was Jewish. I mean, the country does have a history of having killed a lot of Jews a long time ago. That's a whole nother story. But I would say the country is very religious, but what's happening is, I think the same thing that's happening in the United States is that some of the younger people are less inclined to strongly practice with going to church regularly like their parents did. So if you're in the villages, very religious. If you're in the city, the younger people are much less inclined to be strong practitioners of religion. What are the questions?
Did you have a sense when you were there about with the people, what was going to be happening with Russia? Was there any?
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. And so let me tell you a little bit about the work that I did when I was there, because I think that might give some insight too. So I worked with young activists, right? So I worked for a couple of different organizations, but one organization I worked for, they did trainings for cities. So what was happening in the country at the time was the country was moving from a centralized governance to decentralized. So centralized, you had the capital give out money every year to the cities to use as the capital told them to use it. You know, here's your budget for school, here's your budget for roads, right? And they were decentralizing, meaning they were saying, okay, here's your budget, you guys figure out how to spend it. But it also gave the local cities the ability to raise money on their own. So imagine being a local government of a city that has, you know, the city a size of Providence, right? That has never had a city council that had to deal with budgeting. Because they just get a check every year from the state. So now they're getting the money and they have to decide how to budget it. And have public meetings and avoid corruption and make things transparent. And they're also not used to conducting public meetings. They're not used to democracy in action. They're not used to, all of this is new to them. So the organization I worked for did training and technical assistance for cities that were decentralizing. The other, so you know, they're just constantly doing training, constantly. And where I helped, I mean, was with planning, because when you're in a country where people have just been dictated to, they do not know how to do basic organizational planning, basic managing a calendar, basic how to inform the public, basic how to do strategic planning, you know, basic financial planning, basic preparing budgets, things like that. And even how to conduct good training was something that they had a lot to learn, right? So, and the other organization that I did a lot of work with was an anti-corruption organization, because corruption in Ukraine has been high. And the way to do that, the way to decrease corruption is twofold. Number one, you increase community engagement, which is really hard to do in a country where people have not been engaged because they have a deep distrust of government and they just think, why? It's just a waste of time. So they wanted to increase community engagement and educate people on, you know, what their engagement meant. And also to increase transparency, right? So you shine a light on things, then less corruption can occur. Well, it's harder to hide it, right? So they did a lot with things like that. So they were these young, hopeful, engaged people who were building a new Ukraine. And there was no sense from them that they were on any track other than the betterment of their country. It was just amazing. These people were well educated. They were still at universities getting master's degrees. They were getting law degrees. They were multilingual. They were going, they were coming to the United States on study programs. They were going to Germany on study programs. They were going to the Czech Republic on study programs. These were really informed, really smart young people who were extremely hopeful, and so was I. And so was I. They were used to living with an aggressive neighbor who they, you know, didn't like. But there was no sense that this was going to happen. Let me tell you this, the day before the war started, my good friend in Chernobyl, I was on the phone with her, and she was saying to me, next summer, you need to come back and we're going to have fun. We're going to do this, this, and that. Bring so-and-so with you. That was the day before the war. And I would call her up and I would say, are you worried? You know, because we were over here hearing all this news about what was going to, you know, the Russia is going to invade Ukraine. And I'm calling them up and she's like, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. That's what she was saying to me. It's not going to happen. I talked to another American who was working there at the Capitol, and I said to her, are you worried? She said, I only get worried when you people from the US keep calling me up. It's not going to happen. Everyone I also had, I have a friend there who's an English teacher, and I do a lot of being like a guest speaker at my friends' English speaking classes that they do, because then it's like a native speaker visiting them from the US on Zoom. I had an appointment to speak at an English class the day the war started.
Oh.
Everyone was going about their business as usual, and they were like, whoa, we're gonna worry? We've been living next to Russia, invaded us in 2014, and they're still here. What? We're gonna like change our life. They were just not worried. They were not worried. It was, and a friend of mine who was American was there, another friend who was American, and I said, are you worried? Are you like concerned? You know, the US is telling people to evacuate. And he said, oh, I'm leaving in a couple of days. I'm flying out of the capital. And then the war started, and I texted him. I said, well, obviously you're not flying out of the capital now. And he had to, you know, get out of the country over the Polish border. So they were completely, I mean, who knows? I'm sure the government of Ukraine was taking this seriously and planning accordingly, but regular citizens just going about their business, not thinking it was going to happen. Yeah, they were absolutely blindsided. And the part of this that's so heartbreaking for me is that, like, these young people, I would come into work every morning and I would say to them, young people, the future, I would call them, in Ukrainian, I would say, good morning, future of Ukraine, you know, because it's the young people, the ones that bring change in the world, right? And I would say to them, don't get tired. This is going to be a long battle, you know? And little did I know how like not tired they were going to have to be for the fight of their lives here to like preserve democracy in a country that they love. And they don't want to leave Ukraine. They don't want to be refugees. They want to stay in the country. So my friends who were there, I lived in the West. My friends are physically safe. I do have friends who are refugees now because the country imposed martial law, and no male over the age of between the age of 18 and 60 can leave the country. So I have a very good friend of mine who has 2 teenage sons who she's like, I'm getting them out of the country. So she's in Poland now, and she is actually, she's an English teacher. She was the one whose class I was supposed to be on the day the war started. And she is now helping coordinate movements of, movement of individual first aid kits into the country, military grade first aid kits for the territorial defense forces. The Ukrainian who was my manager for Peace Corps in Ukraine has joined the territorial defense force, which is no surprise, right? So a lot of the men I know have joined the territorial defense forces and have picked up guns and are prepared to fight. This English teacher is now on the border in Poland. She's our contact person. We have raised almost 180,000 in the US, and we are actually delivering by plane. We're not mailing. We have a person get on a plane and deliver supplies to her to deliver to the territorial defense forces. I have another friend who has a son who is just getting ready to turn 18, and she said to me, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, I can't tell you what to do, but she left the country because she doesn't want her son stuck in the country. You know, if she didn't leave before he turned 18, then she could not. So what's happening is families are getting split up. This English teacher who I know had to leave her husband behind, right? And leave the country with her son. And she said, we fixed the basement so my husband has a place to hide, and we made the house so he's prepared to fight. And I'm like, oh my God. Then she said, so then she delivers her sons to Poland, and she's like, should I go back and fight with my husband or stay with my sons? I'm like, oh my God, like what kind of choice is that? You know, this other woman who wanted to get her 17-and-a-half-year-old son out of the country is leaving her husband behind because like, what kind of choice is that? You know, what kind of choice is that? My host mom in Chernihiv, fortunately, had moved out of the country just a couple of, she had moved to Italy last year just because she fell in love and moved to Italy. And she just was able to get her mother out of the country. What's happening too is a lot of old people stayed behind because they were like, oh, we've been through hardship. We're not, but mothers with kids were like, I'm getting out of here because I have to protect my children. And now the older people, it's harder to move them because they're older and infrastructure has been severely damaged. I have another friend who is a refugee in Poland, and she was in a really bad car accident and is now had to have surgery and is having rehabilitation from her surgery. And she and I were texting each other this morning. So you see for yourself the refugee crisis, but they want to go back to their country. That's and this woman I know who's the refugee, she was my roommate and my tutor when I lived in Ukraine. And her mother is still there. I'm like, what's up with your mother? And my other good friend, I said, you still speak to your family in Russia, because a lot of Ukrainians have friends and family in Russia. She said, we stopped talking to them because they are just buying into all the propaganda. And I asked my other friend today, I'm like, have you talked to your aunt in Russia? She said, yes, I have. And she completely believes what Putin says. It's just insane to me, especially when they have family members who are telling them, look, this is what's happening to us. I am a refugee because of Putin, and they still believe in, a lot of Russians still believe in the propaganda that they're being fed. What other questions do you have?
What was that photo? If Amy goes back a little bit.
Okay, let's go back.
There was
Which one?
Let's go back to that. Very cool. What is that?
This is, there was always some festival and holoday and celebration or commemoration going on in the square. This is the Holodomor remembrance. So if any of you know about the Holodomor, Stalin had a forced starvation of Ukrainians in, I think it was the 30s. And so this was a remembrance from the Holodomor. Ukrainians were denied grain and any food sources by Stalin. And so this was a remembrance of that. So Ukraine has been through a lot. They really have been through a lot. The whole, Stalin, the Holodomor, the Chernobyl, interesting, holy cow. Talk about interesting, being in a country where people remember Chernobyl so differently than how we remember it from the West. I probably knew more what was going on in Chernobyl than they did when the nuclear disaster occurred. It was insane. It was absolutely insane. And they took if you've seen the HBO documentary, which I highly recommend, it took a while for the government to come clean with people and tell them what was happening. But they were when they decided they had to evacuate kids, the country was putting kids on buses and moving them out of the city, and parents didn't know where the kids were being taken and if they'd ever see those kids again.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really, really, different. And back then, my good friend there, her father lived in the city where Chernobyl was, and he was like 15 when it happened. Her father was, and her grandfather was part of the cleanup operation there. So he died young, probably from radiation poisoning. So this country has known, severe, hardship. So they're kind of used to it in a way. So that's why I think they downplayed the threat that Russia played in their lives. I think they just did not see this coming. They are so patriotic. It's just, they're convinced they're going to win.
And that this is Sheila again. Does that give them the strength to fight?
Oh yeah, they're all going to fight. There is absolutely, yes, they will fight. They will. And I said to my friends there, I said, if you can get to the US, you can live with me. I mean, but they don't want to get to the US. They don't want to live with me. They want to live in their country and they want to fight. And they have no interest in leaving. So my friends who are the young activists there, doing these things like, training people on how to run their local governments and how to have, anti-corruption stuff. Now they're working with humanitarian aid because they're in the western part of the country. You have a lot of people that have moved from the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country. So even if they haven't left Ukraine, they've left their home. So they are now hosting, so they're dealing with their own refugee crisis within Ukraine, right? So my friend who's there, that's what they are doing, is dealing with getting food and shelter to the internal refugees who are in their city. And I talked to her the other day, we were on video, and she was like, I think it's harder for you not to be here than it is for me to be here. Like, wow. And she's been saying to me, you worry too much, right?
Oh gosh.
Right, it's like, I'm like, oh my God, they're a very stoic, strong, patriotic, and they're a country. I will say this, it makes you, being in a country like Ukraine that has very collective thinking, and the US has very individualized thinking. And I think in a time of war, this collective thinking is really helpful because people are willing to do their part and do whatever it takes to help the whole. And they're not thinking what happened to me. They're thinking what's happening to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary?
So, yes, go ahead.
What do you think accounts for their incredible resilience?
I just think it's just having a history of things not going their way. And so they're kind of like Americans, when things don't go their way, they're like, what? I can't, things like in Ukraine, you would constantly trying to get them to plan ahead, which they don't like to do. And you'd be like, oh my God, it made all of us crazy as Americans. Why can't you plan? And they said, why plan when nothing goes as planned to begin with? So they're used to not having expectations, I think, they're used to things. Their expectation is that things are probably not going to work out. In general, I think. Yeah.
That's hard when you're managing a municipal budget.
Yeah. Oh my God. It was crazy. This municipal budget thing. And like before they would get money, like they'd be like, okay, you need a library in your town. You get, 10,000 for your library, say, right? Oh, that town over there, they get 10,000 for their library. They didn't look at, well, what's your population? What are population trends? What's your tax basis? Like, it was just like, okay, you have you need a hospital, you need a library, you need 10 doctors, and it like financially didn't make sense the way they were doing it. So obviously a big fight they have is what to do with these schools, because now also it used to be that people didn't have freedom to move about they couldn't decide where to live. You grew up in that town, you went to school in that town, you stayed in that town. You couldn't just decide to move to the capital to get a job there. That's not the way it worked in the Soviet days, right? So now when young people are free to move about the country, they're leaving their small towns. And so you got these small towns that have declining populations, houses that no one wants to buy, aging population, you know, that are dying off, and their kids don't want to come back and take on the family, you know, house. And they're kind of like, well, maybe we don't need a school there. Maybe we should have a regional school. Well, and I told them, like, we would have some wild meetings, community meetings, where they'd be talking about schools. And it's just like in Rhode Island, right? You start talking about closing a school, people get really emotional, right?
Yeah.
And they show up. Well, it's the same in Ukraine, right? Very emotional issues. We had a librarian hijack a meeting one day because they wanted to close her library in a small village. And we're like, does anyone even go into your library? You know, like, you know, it was just like they're having trouble making decisions like that. But they were working through it, you know, and, you know, but it was really interesting to be a part of that process. So I was in the country when Zelensky was elected, which is the current president. It was the first time in the history of the country that there was no Russian leaning candidate a legitimate top runner, Russian leaning candidate, you know, which also might have been something that got under Putin's, skin, right? So both of the leading candidates were Western leaning, you know, but that was the first time in the history of the elections. And what we did as volunteers, obviously we can't say you should vote for this guy and not that guy. But what we could do is encourage people to get out and vote. And it was the first time ever in the presidential election history that there was a televised debate for the first time ever. And so I said to all my Ukrainian friends, I said, we have got to watch this, you know, and it was, you know, so a lot of, you know, the work we did as volunteers was promoting civic engagement and promoting, you know, being a part of the democratic process, you know. And then some of the young people I worked with were like, well, we went and checked and our name was taken off the voting list, you know, because we were telling them, make sure you're on the voting list, make sure, you know. And it was kind of fun to be there during that time. I had no idea that Zelensky would have this level of leadership qualities. No idea. Complete surprise. And he has the full support of people on the ground in Ukraine right now. Full support.
Wow.
And what was interesting is when when the war first happened, I saw there was a picture on Facebook that I saw, or somewhere on social media. The candidate who Zelensky beat was the incumbent president. And I saw a picture of him. He was joining the Territorial Defense Force to go fight for his country. And he wasn't saying, well, if you had elected me, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah,
like imagine, you know,
Refreshing.
like what kind of picture is that, you know? The incumbent defeated president is joining the Territorial Defense and is not negatively talking about the current president.
Amy, can you mute everybody? I'm getting some feedback or something.
Sure, I can.
All right. Mary, do you want to finish your pictures? Because that prompted a long and wonderful discussion.
Okay, let's just go through them quickly, see if I have anything else I want to. So this was the lake in my city, and you can see people love fishing, and they don't put up houses. They just sit and drill, and they just People in Ukraine love to fish. All right.
But did they need the food? Did they need the food? Was it a source of?
You know, for some of these people, it might have been. Yeah. For some of these people, it might have been. I mean, the living standard there was pretty low. I mean, my apartment cost me like $120. The average salary there was like $150 a month.
And your apartment cost 120?
I think my apartment cost 120.
That's not much
No.
money for food.
Yeah, my city had a lot of universities. So we had an economic university, a medical university, English university, and there was another university, agricultural technical university. Anyway, we had a lot of foreign students in our universities from Egypt and Nigeria, and it drove up the cost of housing in my city because foreigners coming in with money.
Mary, you talked about young people leaving the villages for the cities and not wanting to stay on the family property. What about the farms? Ukraine is like the breadbasket for the world. Who runs those farms?
So the farms are becoming pretty much large agricultural companies are running the big production of wheat that is being exported. What Ukrainians do, because they've lived through a famine, most families had a substantial garden that they used for their own source of food. So most people in the villages had their own plot of land that they themselves lived off. But the food that's being exported is large agricultural companies.
Thank you. So in the villages, it was easier to survive the famine, the starvation.
No, because they had soldiers to go that would kill their cattle or take their cattle and would search their houses and take every ounce of food they had.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it was a serious forced famine. I'm going to give you some recommendations at the end of my talk for books you can read and movies you can watch.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, so let's go to the next slide. We'll see what else I have to show. All right, next. Yeah, all right, when I was there, I had a 60th birthday party for myself just because. So these are two of my young friends.
Mary, how long were you in the Peace Corps?
So I was there for 2.5 years.
Interesting. See, that's a cute picture.
This is my roommate, Oksana, who is now in Poland in the hospital trying to heal her broken leg. Yeah, we communicate regularly. And she's the one whose aunt in Russia still believes Putin. Yeah, all right, next picture. This is, these are the men are American volunteers, and the woman is a Ukrainian woman who I met. And, you know, music brings people together, right? So in my city, we were constantly having volunteers come into the city, and we'd get together with groups of Ukrainians and Americans, and we'd have impromptu concerts, but I got them to sing at my birthday party. Right.
Mary, this is Sheila. Were they used to having Peace Corps volunteers there? Had there been any prior to you?
They were very used to having Peace Corps volunteers there, and they call Peace Corps, you know, soft diplomacy, right? So number one, it helps people with their English because you have a native English speaker, right? But it also helps people with expansiveness around ideas. For instance, I asked a young friend of mine who's Ukrainian, I said to her, I asked her one day, I said, how is your impression of homosexuals changed since you've known so many Peace Corps volunteers who have moved through your city? And she said it's night and day, her impression. And it's all because of being exposed to Peace Corps volunteers. Yeah. It was really, you know, so, but they are so lonely without us there as Americans. We really, and one thing I think we taught them how to do, they're such a stoic, hardworking, serious people that I think we really helped them to like loosen up and have a little bit more fun, you know?
All right, I have to ask this then. So as we have two of your Appalachian Mountain Club people on the call, did they have outdoor fun? Hiking, biking, was there any time for that or were they too busy studying?
The people I worked with were absolutely workaholics. They worked all the time, nights, weekends. These were really, really dedicated. So I just hung out with them, and I did climb the largest mountain in Ukraine, which is not that tall, just because I said, I got to do this. But there were outdoor groups, and they do have ski areas there. Mountain biking is really big there because the roads are so bad that when I was there, I said, you know, I miss my bike. I'm going to buy a bike. So I went to the bazaar and I bought a used bike, and the roads were so bad and so dangerous that I said, I just can't ride my bike here. It's just awful. And I went back to the bazaar and I sold the bike back to the guy I bought it from. So they really liked mountain biking because they can get out in the woods and you can always find a trail. So mountain biking was really big there. And skiing was big and hiking was big. So there were outdoor clubs. I did not participate because the people, I said, I'm only here for a couple of years and I'm here to really spend time with the people that I'm supposed to be working with, you know, so I chose not to really get involved with an outdoor club. This is just your typical Ukrainian table. They love sausage, open-faced sandwiches. That's with butter and caviar on it on the left, that little open-faced sandwich. They eat a lot of mayonnaise, a lot of sour cream, a lot of fat. They call it salo, which is like fat back. It's like raw fat. And they'll puree it. They'll put spices in it. They'll make a spread and put it on bread. And, you know, when you've lived in a place where people have starved, you know, any food that's easy to come by, that's affordable, and that's high calorie is like heavily sought after. They use a lot of mayonnaise, a lot of mayonnaise. All right, next picture. Oh, I guess that's it. Okay. So
That was the last slide. I don't know if you want to go back to any of the beginning.
I don't know if we need to. I'd like to give you a few recommendations. If you'd like to watch a couple of movies that I think are really good movies, so they're enjoyable in and of themselves, but it's also gives you some insight. Mr. Jones is a movie that's about the Holodomor. There's a movie on Netflix called Winter on Fire. It's about the Ukrainian revolution in 2014, which resulted in the overthrow of their president. So you asked what makes Ukrainians resilient? They had a revolution in 2014 and got their president to quit. Like, these are people that like believe in that they can make things happen too, you know? And he left and he, you know, went to Ukraine. He went to Russia. And that was the president that Putin was going to come in and get rid of Zelensky and put this other president in power. I'm like, that sounds like a really bad idea. Sounds like a really bad idea. So I would recommend Winter on Fire and Mr. Jones. There are 3 authors I would recommend if your preference is to read. Anything by Anne Applebaum, anything, just absolutely anything by Anne Applebaum about Ukraine or about Russia. Timothy Snyder is another author, and I read Bloodlands by him before I went to Ukraine, and it made me realize, it just opened my eye. There was just so much that we did not learn in school about that part of the world. And Omer, O-M-E-R, Bartov, B-A-R-T-O-V, he's a professor at Brown University. So he's also local. And his mother is from Ukraine, and she was from a town that I visited regularly, and there was just some horrible slaughter in that town of Jews years ago. But Omer Bartov himself grew up in Israel, but he has written extensively about Ukraine and that part of the world. So I recommend those 3 authors and those couple of movies if you. But they're really good. And if you have not watched the Chernobyl series on HBO, it's a 5-part series. It is eye-opening about what happened at Chernobyl, but also gives a lot of insight into the Russian mindset of just denial and lies and manipulation. I didn't realize just how, I was naive as well. I was naive. My heart is breaking for these people.
Mary, do you hope to return to Ukraine?
Oh, I hope to dedicate the rest of my life to rebuilding Ukraine. Yes.
You might have to do that from here.
I might have to do that from here, Sheila. So listen to this. So I'm just sitting in my little 1-bedroom apartment in Baltimore, and then the war happened. I go, I gotta buy a house. I need a bigger boat, right? I need a place so that I can get people if they can get over here, they can come live with me. So I'm buying a house now. I don't know who's gonna come live with me, but I'm ready for some refugees.
Good, that's good. Yeah.
So
this has been delightful.
Mary,
I'm sorry, this has been delightful, and you are delightful, and they must miss you so much.
They are now they're like, oh my God, you really are Ukrainian, because we're all raising money to send over there. We're like there are volunteers who are helping people, renting people, like hooking people up with someone that can help them escape a city. Who knows what's going on? How can we get this person to safety? Who needs money? I have a friend who's getting horses out of Ukraine because she's an equestrian, and she's like, oh my God, we got to save the horses, And I think they're Ukrainians now are like, oh my God, these Americans really do love us. This wasn't just a passing fancy, Do
you think they're informed at the level that you are? Do they know what's going on?
Oh yeah.
And it's true. Okay, they're getting the real deal.
It is. And it's once people have access to, the world is a different place with access to the internet, right? You cannot control the information that people get. You just can't,
But what about Russia? They're controlling it.
Yeah, somehow they're controlling it, but yeah, I mean, there's always fake news, even in the US, right? There's fake news, right? There's still people that, don't believe things in the US, but the truth can get through in the US. I don't know how they do it in Russia, keep the truth from getting through, but well, they put people in jail, they kill them. That's how, yeah, I mean, it's serious. They really do kill people. They really do.
and now they're having people inform on each other.
Right. Does anybody have other questions for Mary? You've just been going great. I mean, this has been unbelievable, but do anybody else have questions?
Thank you for, go ahead, Jean.
What initially got you interested in going to Ukraine in the first place?
Yeah, so I wish I could say it was some deep love for Ukraine, but this was my thing, Jean. I wanted to do the Peace Corps. I do not like hot weather. So that really limits where I'm gonna go, right? And I wanted to be in community development, and not every country has a community development program. So the
Mhm.
community development programs were heavily in Eastern Europe, in Moldova, Albania, Armenia, Ukraine, right? So that's where, so I was like, well, of those countries, Ukraine seemed the country of size, you know, so I wanted to be somewhere of heft where there was like,
Yeah.
it just felt like really meaningful to me.
Okay.
Was your goal, did you think, I can hear your passion, but did it work out? I mean,
You know,
were you pleased with the work you were able to accomplish?
I went over there thinking I was going to be doing like PhD level economic development work, right? And then you get there and you're like teaching people how to use a calendar, you know, and you're like, all right, let's go back to the basics, right? You know, so it was more, in some ways more basic than I thought it would be, but that's critical, right? Just helping them with policies. And Sheila, I would sit there and I'd be like, we need some policies and procedures, you know, and they're so like young and enthusiastic and creative, but they're not going to sit there and write up a policy and proceed, you know. So it was helping them with some of the more mundane like tasks that they were just had, you know. It was irritating at first because you're like, this is so mundane, but then you realize this is so important.
You know, I hate to dominate the conversation, but that is what American students learn in university. Practicing writing policy, procedures, even in middle school and high school, you know, how do you organize and groups, and they're not getting that. So that's so interesting.
Well, the other, you know, getting back to the education system in Ukraine, the Russian education style was very much memorization, you know, so it wasn't strategic thinking. So I look at what my, you know, like 9-year-old niece does in school, and I'm like, oh my God, they're working on debate classes, like they have to present pros and cons and like what's their thesis, like at 9 years old, you know. And the Ukrainians are used to like more rote memorization, like, you know, kind of like they learn stuff, but they're not learning strategic thinking, you know. So that's a very different kind of skill, and you can't rush that. You don't learn that just because some American came in the room and said, do it this way. It's like you're dripping on them. You're dripping. So you just have to be present and patient, and you drip on them, and then you applaud them and you love them. And then you drip on them the next day. You show up again, and then you show up again, and then you show up again. You just keep showing up, and they're like, oh, she's still here, you know? And you just kind of keep saying the same things, but without judgment or criticism, you know? And then what happens is they go to an internationally funded conference, and someone at the conference says it, and they say, Mary mentioned that. Then they come back from the conference and they said, this person at the conference mentioned that. You're like, really? What do you think of that? You know, so you have to be very non-judgmental and patient and let them come to the conclusion that, well, maybe this is important. Maybe I do have to do this, you know, but that takes time. So it makes it feel like 2.5 years is not enough time at all. You're just getting to the point of like getting them to really trust you and you to really understand them. And then you're leaving, you know, then you're leaving. But it's just dripping on them, drip, 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 you know, but they have to like you and trust you, because no one listens to anyone if they don't like them. You know, so you have to be, and it was so much fun to be their friend, you know, and that's why every morning I would say to them, good morning, future of Ukraine, you know, And if they needed toilet paper for the office, because everyone forgets to buy the toilet paper, I'd go buy it. Like, I'm not going to say that's not my job, like I'll help them clean the office,
Mm.
So, yeah. If anyone is consider, I know that Margie was on. I don't know if she's still on. I know she served in the Peace Corps. If none of you know this, Margie served in the Peace Corps. I'm going to tell her she served in Afghanistan.
I'm here, Mary.
There she is. So I remember you. I
Yeah,
remember you telling me that you served in Afghanistan, and I was
it is
thinking,
life-changing for sure.
yeah, and I was thinking of you last year when they were doing the evacuation from Afghanistan, and I kept thinking of you, I mean, I'm sure the country's so different from when you served,
Yeah, but I think one big, huge difference between our experiences is that you were in a culture that allowed you into their lives, where, as in Afghanistan, if I'd be invited as a teacher to somebody's house for dinner, the women would not even sit with us. They'd be serving us and leaving the room, and I'd be sitting with the men. So I could not have the close relationships with the women in Afghanistan like you did with women in the Ukraine. So
Interesting.
big difference. So I don't have lifelong friends in Afghanistan. And in fact, I think to my horrors that everybody I knew is probably dead, even
Wow.
the young people. So,
Wow.
but it is.
Did anybody else? Has anybody else
Um,
been in the Peace Corps or
Ginny
involved in that?
Bradley. Ginny, can you unmute yourself? We have another Peace Corps alum. You're still muted, Ginny.
It's down in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. Click on that, Ginny.
It looks like a microphone with
Oh,
a,
yes.
yeah.
Hi.
There you
Oh,
are.
yes, I was on the island of Borneo, working with Malaysia in the state of Sabah, which is at the top of the island of Borneo in 1965 to 67.
Wow, one of the early years of the Peace Corps. That's great.
Yes. I was teaching English in the interior, in the jungle, on the edge of the jungle, working with the children of rice farmers. And then because I was just a little older than some of the others, they sent me to a teacher training college. So the second year, I had rather advanced surroundings. I always like to joke, I had a tub. And the first year I had, no facilities, no running water or electricity, but the people were wonderful, wonderful. It
Yes,
was
so
a turning point.
Ginny, you'll appreciate this then. I'm sure you had more rudimentary housing than I had in Ukraine. And so in Peace Corps, they called the Ukrainian assignment Posh Corps.
Yes, I lived in a mud house with no indoor plumbing and an outhouse.
Yeah.
It was cold in winter. Thank
Mary,
you
I
so
had,
much, Mary. It's wonderful to see you, that you survived, that you got out, and that your deep sense of connection and commitment is just wonderful to hear.
it's
Thank
really
you.
inspiring.
Thanks for listening and letting me talk about something that's dear to me.
Well, you make it so, it makes it real to hear about the people and their everyday life, and it's really important because
like
it's so hard
it's-
to watch on the news every night.
If I can share this, the day the war started, of course, I just cried all day. But part of me was crying because of all the wars that have started that didn't cause me to cry.
Yeah.
Because
Mhm.
you cry for people that you know and not for
Yeah.
people you don't know as easily.
Right.
And I said, how casual have I been about other people's plight just because I don't know them?
Yeah.
And so I felt like I was crying for the whole world,
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
I think now we know them a little better ourselves
Thank you.
because of your stories.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and you just
it
have to hope that
personalizes it.
Peace Corps goes back, because when I was in Afghanistan, there were 200 volunteers in the country, and I'm sure there's no Peace Corps there now. So, yeah, you just have to hope, because we make a difference.
We do. We absolutely do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can say that you've made the people you shared with us today dear to us, Mary.
Thank you. I'm glad.
Very, thank you so much.
Okay.
This is wonderful.
Peace.
Wonderful. Thank
Go in peace.
Yeah.
Thank you for making the world a better place.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you for
Bye.
everything you're doing.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
We're going to call it a day. I think we have been on Zoom a long time, and it's